Welcome back. You're watching Australian Agenda, and Paul Kelly and I are now joined by Tony Sheldon, who's the Vice President of the Labor Party as well as the National Secretary of the Transport Workers Union. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Can I just ask you off the top, I guess with your ALP hat on, don't you think that just from pure strategic perspective, whatever you think of the reform process in Gonski and in higher ed with some of the cuts that were announced yesterday, to cut from education to fund education is just a bizarre political strategy?
Look, I think one thing is clear, and that is you have to be actually always balancing what's the best way of, one, bringing the budget home, and secondly, also getting the best value for your dollar. And putting this extra money into our kids is a great way of turning around and improving the education system. I'm very strongly supporting the government's view about this.
But the budget's going to have cuts all over the place. We know that. Why not announce other cuts at this time that aren't in education at the same time as you're announcing the funding mechanism of Gonski? It's just so strange to cut education to fund education.
Look, I think I'm not suggesting I'm the expert on everything being the Vice President of the party, but certainly it seems to me that what's clearly required, particularly with the cuts that have occurred with Conservative governments around the country, state governments, that we have to actually make sure that we look after our kids, and it's not happening under Conservative governments, and we've clearly got to make some choices here, and this appears to be on the right direction.
If we look at the Labor leadership, Simon Crean continues to speak out. He's criticised the Prime Minister very strongly yesterday. How damaging is this?
Look, Simon's another backbencher. Now he's, ironically, a lot of the people that are holding Simon's views up as gospel truth are the same ones that were ridiculing him 2 weeks ago with the fiasco of the challenge from Kevin Rudd. I think it's just a matter of time of moving on, and Simon's got his views. He'll express them rather widely, as sometimes backbenchers do.
I mean, do you think the leadership issue is now settled? Because the fact of the matter is that we continue to see rumblings coming out of the caucus. Look,
we aren't seeing rumblings coming out of the caucus about the leadership issue. This is actually, some of it's a legitimate debate about what constitutes Labor values, what constitutes policy and good policy. And one of the things the Labor Party's always been good at for all the years I've been, the decades I've been involved, and that is debating a lot of the issues, both sometimes internally but also publicly. And that's not always a bad thing. A bit of a health check about what's good for the community and good for the government and good for the party is not a bad thing.
Are you surprised that Simon Crean's doing it now? We've had a leadership showdown. He's gone to the backbench. He's doing it now in the lead up to an election that's going to be a pretty tough fight for the Labor Party, rather than in the aftermath, which is normally the time that you expect to sort of pick through the entrails.
Well, look, Simon's the best person to ask that question is of Simon, why he's made that decision. But my view is clearly this, and this is a very important election for the entire electorate. It has some great challenges, 4, 5, 7's not being the least of them. And we have a challenge regards how this economy is going to perform. We've got a great economy in comparison to the rest of the world. We've got a great economy in itself, and we've got a government that's actually delivering, and that's what we should be concentrating on.
What's your view of the argument, this policy and directional argument that's going on inside the party about the Hawke-Keating tradition? Do you think that Labor's moved away from the Hawke-Keating practice?
Look, I actually have a view that we should move away from the Hawke-Keating practice. I've said that publicly on a number of occasions, not because what Bob Hawke and Paul Keating did in the 80s wasn't appropriate. It was. It made some strident changes for the Australian economy. It's 30 years ago. It's like saying to Hawke and Keating, look back to what Chifley and Curtin and Caldwell did and make the decisions on what you did in the 80s on the basis of that. They wouldn't have made the same decisions if they had have. We need to actually move on and actually talk about where we're at as an international part of the national economy. Things are very different to what they were 30 years ago, and this is about having a vision for the future, not harking back 30 years.
And you spoke a bit about this in a speech that you gave to Young Labor some weeks or months ago, but in that you also talked about how it's the younger generation that's going to have to take up the cudgels of reform. It almost had a tone to it that you'd lost a little bit of faith in the current generation of parliamentary leaders within the Labor Party to do that, whether it's salesmanship or the policies themselves. Do you accept that?
Look, I think it's right across the political spectrum that you've seen, whether it's the Nats or whether it's the Liberal Party and the challenges in the Labor Party as well. stop being managerial politics and be concentrating on what are the values of your political party and take that to the community. And I think that I believe that the policies that Julia's been delivering and this government's delivered on are those policies that actually are about Labor values.
Do you think the next Labor Prime Minister is even in the Parliament yet?
Well, we've got a Labor Prime Minister.
But the next, I mean.
Well, I think we've got some very, very strong leaders for the future, and I think there's a whole raft of people that have a real capacity to be leaders in the future. As well, have no doubt more people coming into Parliament. Obviously, some of those young people we spoke to in Young Labor, that conversation in a different context could be done to every political party in this country, and so we should be taking it up to say what sort of future, what sort of debate, and what are the values we want to take to the Australian community, rather than just managerial politics.
You've used some pretty strong rhetoric to talk about 457 visas. You've described them as a form of slavery. In the broadest possible sense, can you tell us what you're getting at with that?
Well, clearly, if you come over here on a 457 visa, and I think just say from the outset that at no stage has either myself or the national leadership of unions been opposed to 457 visas, regardless of the attempts to pigeonhole this debate. This is not a debate about whether we have 457 visas. It's a question about how we actually implement it and the human rights that should go along with it. If you're brought here...
And you say that, I assume, because there were reports that came out in the aftermath of those statements that you have some people on 457s working within the TWU.
Well, this is the other great irony. Even including the journalists that supposedly broke the story have been dealing with and are fully aware that our staff, that there is a small number of our staff that are on 457 visas, that are specialist staff from overseas that have a long history of involvement in campaigning and community representation.
So what are you talking about when you talk about them as a form of slavery?
Well, when it's a form of slavery is when you turn around and you say, right, if you do not exercise your rights, that you can be deported within 28 days. No matter what you do, if you turn around and you say that, and the employer says that they want to terminate your employment for any reason, then you are deported out of this country in 28 days. What sort of right do you have? And when you look at some of the recent examples, whether it be the example in Northern Territory just recently with a major mine site in the Northern Territory where workers are getting paid hundreds of dollars a week less than Australian workers working side by side, whether you see the recent dispute in Canberra with the construction workers and the painting industry, where they were not workers that were on 457 visas, hadn't been paid for weeks, underpaid by hundreds of dollars, whilst the Australian workers working beside them were getting paid. And you then look at the companies that are having to compete with that sort of exploitation, where people are being exploited on 457 visas. This is an issue that has to be dealt with, and has to be dealt with seriously, and not just with a glib approach that, taking the politics into it. Let's take the politics out of it and actually look at the issue directly.
Well, you're talking a lot about rorts. I just want to try and get some idea, and I know this is difficult, some idea of the quantum here. I mean, in terms of what you think ought to happen, do you think we should have a significant reduction in the number of people in this country on 457 visas?
Look, I think what we should be looking at is categories of what's happening with 457 visas. For example, we've got a 1.1% decline in the amount of dollars being spent in restaurants and cafes. But we've seen an increase in the same period from 46 cooks, chefs a month to 240 chefs a month coming into the country. That says there's something going wrong. That says somewhere in the 457 visa proposal it doesn't add up. You then look at the construction industry. There's been a 6.8% decline in the amount of construction workers. But then you've seen a 38% increase in 457 visas for those same trade skills. You look at the Northwest, you see 27,000 Australians wanting jobs in the Northwest, but then you see miners wanting to bring thousands of people in on 457 visas.
Okay, well, you're talking about pretty hefty changes to the scheme in terms of the quantum, in terms of the numbers overall, I think.
I think, well, it is this issue about how do we get the balance right to make sure that we are adding to skills where there's genuine skill shortages, or where there's skills that can actually increase capacity within the country. I'll give you an example where it's worked. Ryan Stokes, Caterpillar, they have a state-of-the-art training facility, skilling up Australians, apprentices, doing specialist work involving important parts of our infrastructure in this country. They also have some 457 visa people doing the exact same work, being skilled up where there's a shortage of labour, a shortage of skill. That's where you get the balance right. You train Australians, you have other skills where there's a shortage, you get the balance right. And what's happening is the balance is not right. That's why the government is appropriately and should step in to get the balance right.
So would it be fair to describe what you're shooting for, I suppose, is highly skilled individuals that should be on 457 visas only where there are skill shortages, but they're easily addressed with domestic workers, then that should be the priority?
Well, you've hit it in a nutshell, but there's another important piece, and that is that the TAFEs, TAFE colleges have had billions of dollars taken out of them by Conservative governments across the eastern seaboard. We're now seeing that not only are we bringing in 457 visas contrary to the excessive amount of labour that's available in Australia, but we're also seeing that governments are not training, state governments are not training people up to fill those shortages for now and for the future. We've got a pretty difficult combination happening here, but one that says we have to do something about putting Australian jobs first and about job security.
All right, Tony Sheldon, we are out of time. Head of the Transport Workers Union, we appreciate you joining us on Australian Agenda. Thanks very much for your company.
My pleasure.
Paul Kelly, as always, thank you for joining me, and thank you for your company as well. We'll be back at the same time next week.